Recently, I came across a note that I had written in 2014, that's 5 years ago, when I was getting ready to do some teaching at one of my seminars. And the note basically said how culture had gutted the truth. And so you see, this is a theme that I have been working with for a long time. And I would say it doesn't go back 5 years. It actually goes back almost 50 years to when I was converted and gave my life to Jesus Christ when I surrendered to Him, because I was looking for what was true and what was real. And I didn't know at the time that truth and reality are just so well connected. And what was going on in the world back then was just a lot of confusion. Think back to 1970, 1971, if you can't think that far back. And remember the times that were going on right there. I mentioned last time that Bob Dylan had a song in the early 60s called "The Times They Are A-Changin'." And what we saw in the 1970s, certainly the late 60s and early 70s, was the change of those times. And what really affected them? What caused those times to happen? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today.
Welcome to Apologetics for the Rest of Us podcast with Dr. Ray Ciervo. This podcast seeks to simplify the complex challenges to our faith for the everyday follower of Jesus Christ. You'll discover how to give answers to everyone who asks you about the hope within your heart, as Dr. Ray explains not only what we believe, but why we believe what we do. And now here's your host, Dr. Ray Ciervo.
Yeah, so what I want to do today is look at some things that really show us how we got to where we are again, and just show you what kind of post-truth world we live in. And this is very personal to me because it was finding out what is true that really caused me to find out about reality. I wanted to know, what is it all about? I mentioned it goes back to my conversion almost 50 years ago as a returning Vietnam War vet. I have to say I've seen my share of body bags. I've seen my share of planes filled with wounded soldiers coming right from the battlefield. Not something that I want to keep on thinking about. And war does that to you. It's seeing the worst of humanity. It's seeing really what we mean by depravity, how man can go off and just be an evil person. But our hope is in Jesus Christ. And what I want to do is begin by reading some scriptures to you. And this one comes from 2 Corinthians 10, and chapter 10, verses 3 through about 6. Paul wrote this: "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses. We're destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. And we are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ and we are ready to punish all disobedience whenever your obedience is complete." So Paul is talking there about the battle of ideas. He says we destroy speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. And those are ideas that have taken hold in our minds because they challenge who God is. Now, we find them in every place of our culture. We find them in education, we find them in science, we find them in society, we find them in the media. We're always hearing these things that are raised up against the knowledge of who God is. And by God, I mean the being who we know as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. 3 persons in one being. And we see these things challenging who He is. That is, challenging His holiness, His sovereignty, His goodness, His love, and His truth. And with that said, let me read to you from 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15. Paul writes this to Timothy. He says, "But in case I am delayed, I write so that you will know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth. Now, I mentioned elsewhere that I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about the church being the pillar and support of the truth, aside from myself. I've preached and quoted this verse more than a few times because it really refers to the church, and this is a sidebar for Paul. He's talking to Timothy, writing to Timothy, about how someone's supposed to conduct himself as a Christian in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the assembly of the living God. He's referring to going back to Exodus, and where this concept of being the assembly is first mentioned, coming to the mountain of God and hearing God speak. And then he says, this is the pillar and support of the truth. Now, what's happened is the church has become sidelined. And at becoming sidelined, the truth has no pillar and support. Let me say it another way. We don't have a voice into the culture. We are an add-on somewhere else. We are not influencing culture as a people that have the truth because, as we'll see, language has been deconstructed by a postmodern philosophy, which, by the way, was dead on arrival, but it's an idea that has been promoted and circulated not only in the universities, but through the media, through movies, through music. We would say that it's all through our culture that truth no longer exists in the classical sense. We're looking at the idea that truth is just what you think it is, what you make it. In the last podcast, I ended with a quote from Abraham Lincoln. It was on Thomas Sowell Quotes. Thomas Sowell is a political pundit. He's, I think, a modern-day philosopher in that he thinks about thinking, and he talks about thinking quite a bit and how we ought to think. But he quoted a story that Abraham Lincoln asked, I believe it was to the general public. I think I might have mentioned that it was to his cabinet, but he actually mentioned it to the general public. And Lincoln said this. He said, "How many legs does a dog have if you count the tail as a leg?" Well, of course, everybody said 5. And then Lincoln turned around and said, no, the answer is still 4. It doesn't matter what you call that tail, it's still a tail. It doesn't make it a leg just because you call it that. Well, folks, what we're living in today is a culture that says if the tail can be counted as a leg, a dog has 5 legs. That is that whatever we call that thing, that's what it is. There's an echo there somewhere back to Eden. And it is the idea that man can call anything that he wants. And so we can call evil good and good evil, and it makes it that thing. We can call a boy a girl and a girl a boy. And just because we call it that, that's what it makes it. And that's the world we're living in right now, which is kind of scary. Let me give you a couple of other quotes before we go on here. This is from Professor Richard Rorty, who passed away. I mentioned him in my last podcast as well. I believe he taught at Princeton University and then the University of Virginia. And I want to show you the power of ideas. Just hold on to that for a minute. The power of ideas. He's writing about pragmatism. And basically, he's saying that, your mind is not a mirror of reality. In other words, what you see and identify in the world is not a one-to-one recognition in your mind. You're not seeing it as it is. You're seeing it as you want to see it. So your thoughts don't correspond to reality. You really don't know the truth. So he says this. For the pragmatist, true sentences are not true because they correspond to reality. And so there is no need to worry about what sort of reality, if any, a given sentence corresponds to. No need to worry about what makes it true. Interesting. I wonder if he thinks or if he believed, he's gone on now, he's passed on. I wonder if he believes whether or not that sentence corresponds to reality. That's something that we'll talk about in seeing that there are concepts or statements that defeat themselves when you apply the same rules back on them. So if you correspond his rule that he makes right here, we don't have to worry about what makes this true. In other words, anything I say can be true. Now, let me take a deep breath here. What we are saying is that truth has been deconstructed. We're not identifying certainty by that which is true, and we're loaded up, back-end loaded, with a number of other concepts like tolerance, which we'll talk about, that if you say you have the truth, you're not being tolerant because other people have ideas. Not saying that they had the truth. Now, are all ideas equal? In other words, are there no good ideas? Are there no bad ideas? Well, I could testify I have had more than my share of bad ideas, and all ideas are not equal. Some ideas are better than others. Some cultures are better than others because of the way they deal with things. If you go back and look at Canaanite culture, back into the 1,000 to 2,000 years before Christ, that culture was burning babies on their altars. Molech was a god that they worshipped, and they would sacrifice their living children to Molech by placing him on the stone altar and placing him on his hands, heated by fire. And there's horrible stories. Is that a culture we want? We could bring up that we've murdered 50 million unborn children, over 50 million, since 1973, since Roe v. Wade was passed. So there's Richard Rorty basically getting his way. Now, he's just the mouthpiece. There are professors everywhere talking about the same thing. Here's another quote, or another statement we can apply to him. He says, another result of seeing that any belief in our system of beliefs is subject to being revised is that the relationship between beliefs and facts in the world is not a one-to-one correspondence. Now, I think every belief should be examined. I think, is it Socrates who's quoted as saying in Plato that, an unexamined life is not worth living. In my seminary, we had a comparable statement saying that an unexamined faith is not worth believing. And so what we want to do is we want to be able to examine every idea, every system of beliefs. Doesn't mean that it's going to be revised, but it's subject to being revised. We could be wrong. If someone could show us that our ideas are not corresponding to reality. But here the statement that is made about Richard Rorty's beliefs is that the facts of the world and our beliefs are not are not a one-to-one correspondence. So in other words, as we see things, we're not seeing them right. Now, that can be true. I'll give him that. That can be true. But that doesn't mean that everything we say about reality is wrong. They're really referring back to Immanuel Kant again, who said that you can't know reality as it is, only as it appears to you. And that is a brief, compacted statement about what Immanuel Kant believed. I have a bunch of thoughts about Immanuel Kant that we can't talk about right now. But we're going to take a short break, and we'll come back and wrap this up together.
If you're enjoying Apologetics for the Rest of Us, we invite you to help support us. You can donate by going to www.nopatanswers.com and click on the Support Us button. You can also send a check to RCM, P.O. Box 507, Ocean, New Jersey, 07755. We are grateful you are listening to the podcast and pray it helps you strengthen your faith and witness.
So, going back to this, seeing that what's happened to this culture that we live in that is really a post-truth culture and see the reality of what's going on in our society. Basically, we have gutted truth and made truth to be something that it is not. And that's really the problem with what we're doing. Now, let's be clear about a couple of things that are being said here. Rorty and Michel Foucault and Jean-Paul Sartre, they all depend on truth. They all depend on the classical definition of truth is that which corresponds to reality, or truth is telling it like it is. Those things are some things that they are depending on. Excuse me just a minute. Let's just make one thing clear, that Richard Rorty, Michel Foucault, Jean-Paul Sartre, any of them, John Dewey, they can say whatever they want to say about truth, but the reality of it is that they are depending on the classical view of truth. They're depending that what they are saying actually corresponds to reality. Let's just understand it this way. You cannot deny absolute truth without affirming it. Let me say that again. You can't deny absolute truth without affirming it. The statement, there is no such thing as truth, has to be true. So in the statement, you're saying there's no such thing as truth, but you're depending that your listeners understand that what you mean is that statement is true. So basically, you're cutting yourself off the limb. You're sitting on the wrong side of the saw while you're sawing this log, and it crashes down to the ground. To say no one can know the truth is basically saying that I know that you can't know the truth. I know it's true that you can't know the truth, or that anyone can know the truth. So they're all affirming the reality that truth is that which corresponds to reality by denying it. And it is a self-defeating statement. It doesn't live up to its own standards, or it's a contradiction in terms. And that's what they're doing all throughout. And let's understand a principle that I don't think anybody can refute, and that is that ideas have consequences. Ideas lead somewhere. Good ideas lead you to good things. Bad ideas lead you to bad things. If they are true ideas, they will lead you into truth. They will lead you into more truth. And basically, our problem in society today is that we have a brain drain, or we do not have refined minds. We're called on to renew our minds. But I don't believe that even the church, which is supposed to be the pillar and support of truth, has really grappled with the truth of Scripture by having their minds renewed, or having our minds renewed. That is, having our minds trained to think critically, to think with our minds and not with our eyes. You see, our eyes are made to see things, but we should let what we see pass through our eyes into our minds, and then we can judge what we are seeing, rather than just taking everything at face value and thinking that's what it is. No, we have to be able to understand what the idea of nature is, and that things have a nature. Rorty and John Dewey, they both refuted or refused the idea that even truth has a nature, that there was a nature to truth, and that it corresponds to reality. But once again, just listen to the thought. They're denying that truth has a nature. So the question to ask is, is that true? Let me give you a real simple principle to live by. Okay? Anything that is not true is not worth believing. You ought to believe only in things that are the truth. Now, that ought to make you a truth sleuth. You ought to be someone who is seeking out the truth about everything. And what do we live with today? We live in a world of fake news. People make statements as journalists and political pundits without finding out the facts. So we have to have someone who is a fact checker. But now we have to also have fact checkers on the fact checkers. We're dealing with this kind of stuff all the time, and it gets wearying. But it comes down to this, is that the church has lost its voice in the culture, in the marketplace of ideas. We have lost our voice because we have not supported the truth. We have not been able to confront the lies with facts about reality. And that is one of the first points that we learn in apologetics, that truth about reality is knowable, that we can know truth about reality. Now, do we always know it perfectly? No, we don't. But we know it by the evidences that are there, and it's about how well we can interpret the evidence. I'll give you a for instance here, in a couple of for instances. The idea of the universe having a beginning is no longer an issue. At one time, the atheists argued that the universe was eternal. But the Big Bang put that, or the Big Bang Theory, not the TV show, but Einstein's theory, or what was promoted through something that Einstein checked out. Edwin Hubble, the man that the Hubble telescope is named after. Basically, all these things came out of the idea that the universe, or the idea that the universe had a beginning, came out of Einstein's theory of relativity, that time, space, and matter are correlative. In other words, they go together, that whatever created, or however the universe was created, at the beginning, time, space, and matter came into existence. So it didn't exist before that beginning. So what did exist back there? Well, that's called the cosmological argument. It looks at causes and what is the beginning or the first cause of the universe. Well, the atheists or the naysayers, they attack that. They attack the idea that there could be a God that's doing that. And then now we have what we call the fine-tuning argument, which began, or in classical apologetics and classical philosophy, is known as a design argument, a teleological argument. And they've attacked that there can be any random number of chances to make the universe perfectly ordered the way it is. And they're trying to refute the fine-tuning. They'll always refute that, or try to refute it anyway, but the facts will bear out that the universe is finely tuned. What they're denying is the cause, and they're trying to attack the idea of the truth about reality, that we can't know it as it looks. A simple thing to argue is that, where does information come from? Have we ever seen information come from anything but a mind, an intelligent mind? Information just doesn't pop out of rocks. I tell you a story. The one time I was on a radio show, and there was an atheist, myself, the host of the show, and another pastor. I was remote. I was not in the studio, and so I couldn't just speak into the microphone and let them hear what I was saying. They had to click me in when they thought it was time for me to answer. And it was a very frustrating experience, because the preacher kept trying to tell the atheist that he knew the truth about reality and knew that he was rejecting Jesus, and, why don't you just capitulate and become a Christian, and that sort of anti-witnessing. And I had, a couple of things that I could say. And then finally, at the end of the show, toward the end of the show, the host actually opened my mic and let me ask some questions. So I asked them something based on science. I said, do you believe that science is the study of causes? Do you believe that causes, all effects have a cause? And he said, yeah. He said, I believe that. I'm, just summarizing basically how the conversation went. So I said, so you believe that all the effects that we see in the universe, even the universe itself, because it's not eternal, hasn't gone on forever, is an effect? He said, yes, I believe that too. So, we could argue about the causes, but I said, I have a specific question I want to ask you. Is it that if every effect has a cause, what's the cause of information? If information is an effect because it's in the universe, what's the cause of it? If matter was all there was in the beginning, how can we say that what we have today is information and it's an effect? Where did it come from? And then we had what we call radio silence. There was nothing there. And I said, well, he finally said, I don't know. And I said, well, let's just say this. All information comes from a mind. Now, is that true or not? No answer. Again, radio silence. But you see, you can argue these things if you know how to think critically, if you follow things to their logical conclusion and so on and so forth. But we're living in a world where this idea has been let out of the box. And even though it's the idea that truth doesn't exist or absolute truth doesn't exist, or our idea of reality is not a one-to-one correspondence, that we're not seeing reality as it is, that you can't know reality, that idea has been let out of the box. And as the church, if we are going to say that Jesus Christ is your Savior, that He is the King, that He is coming again, and that's the truth, and we are the pillar and the support of truth, then what we need to do is become what I call the truth sleuth. We have to start to look at how do we find what actually are the facts, that they correspond to reality, and engage our culture to make an impact with the gospel in the name of Jesus. We want to impact the world with the power of the gospel, the truth of the gospel. So what we need to do is become that truth sleuth and be able to declare who Jesus Christ is. We need to see ourselves in the church as the pillar and support of the truth. If Jesus is not alive from the dead, then we have lied about God. That's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. We have become liars in declaring something that God has not done. But if in fact we know that Jesus is alive from the dead, then we have to guard the truth. We have to guard the truth of the gospel, and we have to guard the truth in general, absolute truth and what it is. And that's an idea that has been raised up against the knowledge of God, that truth about reality is unknowable, or truth about reality is something that doesn't exist. So are you ready to become a truth sleuth and get on the road and begin to stand for truth and recognize truth, become a critical thinker? I'm going to turn over right now, and I'm going to turn off right now, and look forward to talking to you again. But again, we have to be people of the truth and find out how we can think critically and no more of what I would call stinking thinking, and begin to think critically about what's going on around us and how do we engage. And we'll look at that next time. Remember, apologetics is not done in a vacuum. We can make an impact on this culture, and we ought to. We ought to affect every aspect of it. We've lost it in the United States of America. I'd say we'd lost it in all of Western Europe, in Western society, whether English-speaking world or certainly Western Europe and the English-speaking world, Canada, Australia, United States, New Zealand, South Africa. We've lost the power of truth in our culture, but it's time we can get it back. Okay, so for real this time, I'm going to turn off. And until the next time, I trust that you will be seeking ways to share your faith with a lost and dying world.
You've been listening to Apologetics for the Rest of Us with Dr. Ray Ciervo. We hope you've enjoyed this episode and subscribe to our podcast. Also, please visit our website at www.nopatanswers.com, where you'll find more information about conferences and seminars. If you have questions for Dr. Ciervo, you can email him at info@nopatanswers.com. Have a great day, and God bless.